Now, to grasp the Cold War, you need to examine its geopolitical, its economic, and its ideological roots. You need to study and think about underlying structures and ideas. At the same time, in order to grasp the origins of the Cold War, both the beginnings of the Cold War and in order to grasp the end of the Cold War, you also need to focus on human agency. And by that I mean the personal roles of key leaders like Truman and Stalin at the beginning of the Cold War, and Reagan and Gorbachev and George H.W. Bush at the end of the Cold War. In terms of personal agency, my argument today, my theme today, is that no single person exercised more influence on the origins and the evolution of the Cold War than did George C. Marshall. And I mean this in two critical ways. First, and this is a provocative argument, first, Marshall played a very important role in launching the policies that catalyzed the Cold War, that caused the Cold War, that institutionalized the Cold War, so to speak. At the same time, Marshall built the architectural foundations that won the Cold War. Marshall was an incredibly important figure, both in causing the Cold War and winning the Cold War. Now let me explain these big generalizations by first illuminating the geopolitical and economic structures and the ideological crosscurrents that existed in the middle 1940s when the Cold War first began to take shape. Now, when scholars talk about geopolitics, they mean something pretty simple. They're talking about the distribution of power in the international arena. What was the distribution of power? What was the geopolitical configuration of the world in the middle 1940s? And simply stated, you need to keep in mind that the United States was the only true global power in the middle and late 1940s. Keep in mind, Europe was divided. Soviet armies occupied half of Eastern Europe, half of Europe, Eastern and Central Europe. Soviet armies were there not because of aggression, but because they had driven Nazi armies out of Soviet Russia, back into Germany, and as a result of that, Soviet armies occupied half of Europe in 1945. Keep in mind, Germany was defeated, devastated, occupied by four powers: the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and a small occupation zone for France. Germany, defeated, devastated, occupied. Think about the countries of Western Europe in the middle of 1945. France, Belgium, Holland, they were weakened. They were demoralized. They were divided within because of the history of collaboration of many Frenchmen and many Europeans with the Nazi occupiers. There was tremendous ferment and division inside these very weakened European countries. United Kingdom, Great Britain, was victorious in the war, but financially emasculated by the time the war ended. Think of East Asia. China was devastated as a result of the war with the Japanese. And as soon as the war ended in 1945 and 1946, China was engulfed in civil war. Japan was defeated, vanquished, and occupied by one power, the United States. In the rest of Asia and Africa in 1945 and 46, you had the rumblings of revolutionary nationalism as European empires began to erode. So the United States in 1945 and 1946 was the only global power. The United States strategically dominated the Western Hemisphere. The United States controlled the oceans with worldwide bases that had been established during the war. The United States monopolized the occupation of Japan. The United States occupied South Korea. The United States had 2 divisions of Marines in North China. The United States was playing a key role in the occupation of Germany. The United States had a huge strategic air force. No other nation had anything like it. The United States had a massive blue ocean navy at the end of the war. And of course, the United States had a monopoly over atomic weapons. The United States was the only global power. The United States was not only militarily preponderant, but the United States, as a result of the war, also was enjoying, as the war came to an end, unparalleled prosperity. For most Americans in 1945 and 1946, they could not believe how the war had enabled the country to overcome the Great Depression. And in terms of comparative economic power, in 1945, when World War II ended, the United States had 2/3 of the world's gold reserves, 50% of the world's manufacturing capacity, 50% of the world's shipping capacity. The United States economy, its gross domestic product at the end of the war, was 3 times the size of Soviet Russia's and 5 times the size of the United Kingdom. Compared to the United States, the Soviet Union was economically incredibly weak. The Soviet Union was economically devastated during the war. And the Soviet Union, Soviet Russia, was demographically decimated. Just keep in mind a few figures. 25 to 27 million Soviet citizens. 25 to 27 million Soviet citizens died during World War II. The Nazis destroyed 1,700 cities and towns and 70,000 villages. They demolished 6 million buildings and 31,000 factories. The Nazis wrecked the 61 largest power plants inside European Russia, and they destroyed 3,000 oil wells. And as the Nazi armies retreated back toward Eastern Europe and Germany, they tore up 35,000 miles of railroad track, hoping to slow down the advance of Soviet armies after them. The Nazis devastated the rural economy of European Russia. It's estimated that the Nazis slaughtered 17 million head of cattle, 20 million hogs, 27 million sheep. There was no comparison. The Soviet Union was economically very weak at the end of the war. In Europe, France, Belgium, and Holland faced a huge task of reconstruction, especially industrial reconstruction. European countries needed food and fuel. And in order to get food and fuel, they needed dollars to buy food and fuel. But they had no dollars. And so Reconstruction began to proceed with great, great difficulty. Germany and Japan were ruled by occupation authorities. In Germany, there were 4 occupation authorities. In Japan, only 1. But regardless, in both Germany and Japan, the aim of the occupation initially was not economic rehabilitation. The aim was to punish the war criminals and to bring about political reform, demilitarization, disarmament, denazification. That was the focus, not economic rehabilitation. And when John McCloy, the very influential Assistant Secretary of War, visited Western Europe, the western zones of Germany and Holland, as soon as the war ended, he wrote back to his boss, Henry Stimson, the Secretary of War, there's complete economic, social, and political collapse going on in Central Europe, the extent of which is unparalleled in history. The big generalization in 1945-46, the United States was prosperous, but Americans feared the possibility of another Great Depression. And why did they fear it? They feared it because the international economy was in very precarious shape. The international economy was warped by war, fragmented by exchange controls and quotas and barter agreements. And the international economy was haunted by memories of the Great Depression itself. Now, this economic dislocation engendered huge social misery at the end of the war. The misery, of course, was the product of the war itself, but it did not end when the war ended. Economic dislocation and social misery highlighted the possibility of intense ideological conflict. A big generalization that will surprise many of you probably was that at the end of World War II, liberal capitalism was in disrepute almost everywhere except the United States. Why was that so? It was natural. It was the fact that peoples everywhere in Europe and Asia often thought that capitalism had been responsible in their own lifetime for 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And communists everywhere tried to capitalize on the economic dislocation and social misery and the perceptions of many people that capitalism would simply revive the sequence of developments that had brought on 2 world wars and a Great Depression. And keep in mind, the communist parties in Western Europe were extremely popular at the end of World War II. In places like France and Italy, in perfectly free elections in 1945 and 1946, the Communist Party always got somewhere between 35 and 45% of the vote. The Communist Party in France and Italy, never a majority, but nonetheless always was either the first or second leading party in terms of popular voting in France and Italy in 1946 and 47 and in 48. And in these same years, keep in mind, the communist parties in countries like Holland, Denmark, and Norway were also getting at least 10% of the popular vote. The desire for change, for radical change, for transformation was bubbling everywhere, simmering everywhere. In fact, Dean Acheson, who would become Secretary of State, but in 1945 and 46 was Assistant Secretary of State, he told Congress at the end of the war, the peoples of Europe and Asia, I'm quoting, have suffered so much that they will demand that this whole business of state control and state interference shall be pushed further and further. Now keep in mind, this desire for social transformation, radical change, was everywhere. Keep in mind that in our staunchest ally, Great Britain, United Kingdom, what happened in the summer of 1945? Winston Churchill, the great wartime hero, the leader of the Conservative Party, was defeated in the elections. Right as the war ended, he was defeated by the Labour Party. The Labour Party was a socialist party. The Labour Party called for nationalization of key industries. And in 1946 and 47, 48, key industries, coal, steel, power, were nationalized in Great Britain. The Labour Party called for a vast social welfare program. The point of this is to say that the victory of the Labour Party, the defeat of Churchill, just highlights, reifies the degree to which people in Europe wanted change. It reifies, it illuminates the degree to which American conceptions of liberal capitalism were in disrepute. If capitalism was going to survive, liberal capitalism, policymakers had daunting challenges ahead of them. And not only in Europe, but throughout what would become known as the Third World, throughout Asia and Africa. Marxism Leninism was extremely popular. Why? Marxism Leninism rationalized away the backwardness of peoples in Asia and Africa. Oh, it's not your fault. The reason you're undeveloped is because you've been exploited. And the British and the French and the Dutch have ripped you off. That's why you're backward. And Marxism, Leninism, and the Soviet model of development seem to hold out the prospect of rapid modernization. After all, peoples everywhere looked to the Soviet Union in the late 1940s, and they were mesmerized by the fact that a command economy had stood up to Hitler and ultimately played a key role in vanquishing Nazism. For peoples all over the Third World seeking independence, development, and modernization, the Soviet model of development seemed to be very attractive. So this peculiar mix of post-war circumstances, these geopolitical, economic, and ideological circumstances, conjured up great fear and apprehension in the United States. The Soviets dominated half of Europe. The communist parties in France and Italy were on the cusp of winning power or seizing power. In Greece, the communists were battling the royalists in real fighting, a real civil war. In China, another civil war was going out with the nationalists and the communists inside China, fighting for control of China. In Southeast Asia, Indochina, South Asia, European empires were beginning to crumble. The British relinquished control of India, recognized Indian independence as the war came to an end. And even in Germany and Japan, where the United States was playing a key role or a dominating role, there was tremendous anxiety about what would happen when the Americans left. Because in 1945 and 1946, everyone did expect the Americans to leave. And the great fear was, would that provide yet additional opportunities for the Soviet Union to expand, to lure Germany or Japan into a Soviet communist orbit? So President Harry Truman in 1945 faced just formidable challenges, because he had been elected vice president along with Franklin Roosevelt in the fall of 1944. Truman never expected that he would become president. Franklin Roosevelt never confided anything about foreign policy and military strategy to Harry Truman so long as he lived. When Roosevelt came back from the Yalta Conference, he did not tell Harry Truman anything about what had gone on at the Yalta Conference. And Truman himself acknowledged, it's not historians saying this, Truman himself acknowledged that he was totally unprepared for the office of the presidency, particularly unprepared to handle the formidable problems of foreign policy that he was inheriting. Truman was very cognizant of his own inadequacy. "Pray for me now," quote unquote, he said to a small group of journalists on the day he took the oath of office. Moreover, Truman's desire, as the war came to an end in May 1945 in Europe, and then August 1945 in Asia, as the war came to an end, Truman's desire, his personal desire, was to focus on domestic policies, That's what he knew about. That's what he cared about. And Truman chose, in the spring of 1945, he chose James Burns, an old friend from his Senate days. He selected James Burns to be his Secretary of State. And he hoped that Burns would handle all these problems and leave him alone to focus on domestic problems. But within 6 or 8 months, Truman grew very disillusioned with Burns. He felt, in many ways, betrayed by Burns. And at the same time, Truman was engulfed with domestic issues. After the war ended, there was a huge amount of post-war social turmoil inside the United States. There were massive numbers of labor strikes, and there was significant inflation. And the Republicans were eager to capitalize on these problems to capture control of the House and the Senate in the 1946 congressional elections. And they ran on the platform, the Republicans did, quote, end quote, had enough. Have you had enough of strikes? Have you had enough of price increases? Have you had enough labor turnover? Have you had enough of Harry Truman? And the American people said, yes, we've had enough. And they voted in large majorities of Republicans in the House and Senate for the first time since before the Great Depression. What's interesting about the Republicans who came into the House and the Senate in late 1946 was that they were not terribly interested in foreign policy. What they wanted to do, and what they had campaigned upon, was to lower taxes, cut spending, raise tariffs, hunt for domestic spies. They were against foreign aid. They were against big government. They were not interested in foreign aid or Reconstruction. Their focus was domestic. In this context, Truman turned to General George Marshall. He had enormous respect, personal respect, for Marshall. Marshall, of course, had been the architect of victory during World War II as the Chief of Staff of the American Army. Truman had asked Marshall to do him, the president, a personal favor in late 1945 and go to China to try to mediate an end to the civil war between the nationalists and the communists. And General Marshall spent a very large part of the calendar year 1946 inside China, trying to mediate an end to that conflict, and he failed to do so, but he learned some very important lessons in trying to bring these two parties together, Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek. Marshall failed. He returned to the United States, and Truman already had asked him, as he was about to come home from China, to become the Secretary of State, to take over from James Burns, who Truman now is really eager to get rid of. Marshall actually actually did not want to become Secretary of State. He wanted to retire. He had run the army and orchestrated the victory during World War II for 5 years. He had spent a grueling year in China. His health was not great. He wanted to retire. But when asked to serve by the President of the United States, he decided to do so. What did Marshall do? I think what he did during the next 2 years, in 1947 and 48, was truly remarkable. What did he do? Let's think about it. First, Marshall scanned the geopolitical, economic, and ideological landscape. He looked upon around the world. He knew a lot about the world. What did he see? To sum up, this is what he saw, the things I've told you about. The Soviets were consolidating power in Eastern Europe in places like Hungary and Poland. The Soviets were exerting pressure on Iran and on Turkey. Western Europe was experiencing economic paralysis. Reconstruction and rehabilitation was floundering. Communist parties were gaining strength. Civil wars were going on in Greece and China. And then just as he became Secretary of State in early 1947, the British announced to Washington quietly that they were withdrawing from the Eastern Mediterranean, creating a vacuum of power in places like Greece and Turkey. And then Marshall went to Europe for his first foreign ministers conference. A couple of months after taking office, he went to Europe in March 1947 for a foreign ministers conference. He went to Moscow, that's where it was. And he spent several weeks in Moscow and had several personal discussions with Stalin, and at the end of which Marshall concluded very definitely Stalin was seeking to capitalize on these massive opportunities that existed in many places in the world. He scanned the strategic landscape, and then Marshall developed a strategic concept. Actually, the strategic concept was one that had guided him through World War II. The strategic concept was simple. The United States must not allow any adversary or coalition of adversaries to gain control of the preponderant resources of Europe and Asia. The United States must not allow any adversary to gain control, directly or indirectly, of the preponderant resources of Europe and Asia, because if such an adversary did, that adversary would be able to develop the capabilities to wage war against the United States and perhaps even win. Why did Marshall have this strategic concept? Because that's exactly what the Nazis and Japanese had done. In 1940 and 41, 39, 40, 41, 42, the Japanese and the Germans had gained control of the resources of Europe and Asia, assimilated those resources, and dared to attack the United States and wage a protracted war against the United States. After the war was over, the threat was not Germany and Japan, but there was one nation that might have the capability to gain control of the preponderant resources, and that must not be allowed. That was the basic strategic concept. But Marshall did more than have a strategic concept. He had an acute perception of threat. He assessed threat incisively. And based on intelligence that he was receiving, and based on his own experience, he came to the following conclusion. The Soviet Union would not seek to gain preponderance through premeditated military aggression. The Soviet Union was not likely to engage in military aggression. The Soviet Union, he calculated correctly, was too weak comparatively to risk a war with the United States in 1946, 47, 48, 49. But Marshall recognized that a real threat existed. The Soviet Union might well capitalize on the economic distress in key places in Western Europe and Northeast Asia. Stalin might orchestrate and support communist victories or seizures of power in France and Italy. Stalin might be ready to lure Western Germany and Japan into a Soviet orbit when the Americans left, and it was expected that the Americans would leave. Stalin indirectly, Marshall concluded, especially after his talks with Stalin in March and early April 1947, he concluded that Stalin's aim was to exploit the vulnerabilities that existed to expand Soviet interests and power. What else did Marshall do? Develop an acute perception of threat that related to his strategic concept. And then he reorganized the State Department and established a policy planning staff and brought in George Kennan, the father of containment policy, to be the head of the policy planning staff. Marshall, a military man, believed you had to have good planning, which the State Department did not have. And he gave Kennan tremendous authority inside the State Department. And like Marshall, Kennan believed that the Kremlin was not intent on going to war militarily, but was very much hoping to capitalize on post-war economic distress and social turmoil. And like Marshall, Kennan believed that Stalin would not risk war. Kennan believed that Stalin shrewdly assessed correlations of power and knew that the Soviet Union could not win a war against the United States. Marshall, along with Kennan's help, then did something else that's strategically critical. He set priorities. What should the United States focus on? If the United States were to give aid, should it be economic aid or military aid? Where should it go? There was tremendous controversy inside the United States government about where the aid should go and what type of aid it should be. Marshall was clear. Western Europe, Western Germany, the western zones of Germany controlled by Britain, France, and the United States, and Japan should be America's priorities. He had been in China, and although there was a huge groundswell of sentiment in the United States for aid to China, Marshall believed that was not wise. China was too weak to be important, and Chiang Kai-shek was too incompetent and unreliable to support. The focus should be on Western Europe, Western Germany, and Japan. That's where critical industrial infrastructure existed and could be developed. Marshall then developed tactics to achieve his goals. He made a very critical decision. Economic aid should take priority over military aid and should take priority over America's military rearmament. Policymakers, he believed, had to make tough choices and set priorities. The greatest vulnerability were the economic vacuums of power in Western Germany and Western Europe. Let's focus on that and provide economic aid for economic reconstruction and thereby undercut the popularity of communist parties inside those countries. Marshall said, we must support the revival of production in the western zones of Germany. We must boost the levels of industrial production in the western zones of Germany. The British and the Americans and the French controlled how much would be produced. And the agreements in 1945 was to limit production inside Germany to incredibly low levels. Marshall said, this is counter-effective. So did Kennan, so did others. Marshall said, no, we need to boost the levels of industrial production. We most importantly have to boost coal production in the western zones of Germany, in the Ruhr and in the Saar. We must increase coal production, not just in Germany, but mostly because the rest of Western Europe desperately needs coal in order to rebuild. Marshall believed we had to win Germany over, at least West Germany, to the American side. So he supported merging the Western zones, the French zone, the British zone, the American zone, merging them together and creating a provisional government that would become West Germany. And he supported integrating the economies of Western Germany with Western Europe. That was a key part of the Marshall Plan. And in East Asia, he said, we need to focus on Japan, not China, and we need to shift our occupation policies in Japan from reform, political reform, to economic rehabilitation. What else did Marshall do? He understood that mobilizing domestic support was indispensable. Let me tell you, in early 1947, or in May 1947, or June 1947, when Marshall went to Harvard and articulated what would become known as the Marshall Plan, the European Recovery Program, if you were making a bet inside the United States, you would not have bet that Congress would support this. Because the Republicans dominated Congress. And they were not eager for huge programs of foreign economic aid. What Marshall did was two things. One, he nurtured an incredibly productive personal relationship with Arthur Vandenberg, the Republican senator from Michigan, who was the head of the Foreign Relations. He met with him time and time again. And at the same time, Marshall, despite his illnesses, traveled across the country to give speeches trying to explain to the American people why a program of economic aid to Europe was critical. Marshall did not like the anti-communist rhetoric that Truman had used to mobilize support for aid to Greece and Turkey in the Truman Doctrine. Marshall was critical of that. He did not like bitter anti-communism. He wanted to present something constructive, positive, saying that by giving aid to like-minded allies, we can nurture support for our values and our interests. And doing that is indispensable for the long-term health of the United States itself. And Marshall believed something that was really interesting. He believed, and basically he was right, that millions and millions and millions of American soldiers had fought abroad, had lived abroad. And he believed, and he wrote this time and again, I think that Americans are no longer really isolationists. They've been here in Europe. They've been in the Pacific. They've been in Japan. They know the importance of American interests abroad. So Marshall's strategic calculus was to use American wealth and power. After all, that's what the Marshall Plan was about. Roughly $12 million of American aid over 4 to 5 years to build up Western Europe. To use American wealth and power to overcome the vulnerabilities that he believed Stalin wanted to exploit. The aim? To prevent Russia from gaining control of Europe and Asia directly or indirectly. Marshall wanted to use America's wealth and power to create incentives for key allies to work together in behalf of shared values and shared interests. For example, open, non-discriminatory trade, the free flow of capital, individual freedom. Provide incentives to those key countries that shared those values and interests. Now, strategic calculus, strategic wisdom meant accepting very tough trade-offs. You will probably be surprised to know that Marshall and Kennan and many intelligence analysts understood that when they offered economic aid to Western Europe, and when they determined to build up the western zones of Germany, they understood that their actions were immensely provocative. Marshall understood that Stalin would see America's initiatives as threatening to the Soviet Union. Why? Why? Because the Marshall Plan was initially offered to Eastern Europe and even to Russia, as well as to Western Europe. Stalin saw that as an effort by the United States to use its capital and its trade to undermine Soviet rule in Eastern Europe. Stalin thought that the United States was trying to play a fast trick on him, to use its wealth and power to undercut Soviet domination of Eastern Europe. But far more importantly, far, far, far more importantly, Stalin believed that building up the western zones of Germany industrially and economically and unifying them into Western Germany created a huge long-term threat. Time and again, Stalin said, Germany will revive and engage in aggression again. That was a fundamental axiom of Stalin and really of all Europeans. Why did they believe this? Because that's exactly what had happened. Germany had been defeated in World War I, disarmed, made to pay huge amounts of reparations, and within a decade after that, the Nazis had conquered all of Europe and much of Russia, and had inflicted unprecedented harm. Stalin saw the specter of a revived Germany. What did Stalin do? In response to the Marshall Plan, Stalin cracked down on Eastern Europe. It's after the Marshall Plan was announced that Stalin orchestrated the coup, the communist seizure of power in Czechoslovakia. It's when the Americans and the British and the French started to commit themselves to building up West German industry and launching a big currency reform in Western Germany that Stalin imposed the Berlin blockade. The big purges in Hungary and Romania and Bulgaria escalated in this period of time when Stalin perceived that the Americans were trying to undercut Soviet authorities in Eastern Europe. George Kennan and General Marshall were not surprised. They expected these things. Strategic calculus meant accepting big trade-offs. Their big trade-off, think about this, their huge trade-off was to say, reviving, reconstructing, and co-opting Western Germany, Western Europe, and Japan were more important than precipitating a Soviet clampdown in Eastern Europe and institutionalizing the Cold War. There were worse things, they said, worse things than what would become a Cold War. What was worse was if you did nothing, the Soviets might actually capitalize on all the opportunities that were before them. And so the benefits seemed to outweigh the costs. That took a lot of strategic calculus, and it was a big risk. But Marshall and Kennan were willing to take these risks because they believed that Stalin might clamp down, launch a Berlin blockade, but he did not want to risk war. That was the calculation. And so Marshall supported the airlift to Berlin, to support Berlin over the blockade. Marshall and General Clay, the head of occupation in Western Germany, they made a calculation. The Soviets will not shoot down American and British planes and risk war. They were right. They were right. And they believed that over time, the Soviets, when they could not capitalize on vulnerabilities, the Soviets would begrudgingly accept them and ultimately negotiate an end to the Cold War. But the immediate response of building up the western zones of Germany that so frightened the Soviet Union, the immediate response was to frighten our European allies. The French were infuriated and apoplectic about the fact that a key part of the Marshall Plan was rebuilding Western Germany. Why? for the same reasons the Soviets were. They feared the recreation of German power. And the French said to the British, and then the British and the French both said to the Americans, look, if you want us to take this risk of allowing the rebuilding of German power, you need to guarantee our security. If you are going to rebuild Western Germany, which might provoke a Soviet attack in the short run, or which might rebuild German power in the long run, we want guarantees of our security. One of Marshall's great assets was his flexibility, his capacity to empathize with the needs of prospective allies. It was not Marshall's intention to negotiate a North Atlantic treaty, but when he saw that it was essential to negotiate that treaty and establish what would become the NATO alliance, in order to get the French and the Dutch to go along, Marshall said, okay, let's accept, for the first time in our history, strategic obligations for the long term. Think about Marshall's accomplishments. Think about the way he went about pursuing things. He precipitated, in some ways, the Cold War, but he also established the essential architecture to win the Cold War. What did he do? What did it mean to be a master strategist? First, possessing a coherent strategic concept, assessing risks incisively, setting priorities, linking means and ends, grasping the fears of friends as well as the motives of adversaries, recognizing the need for bipartisan political consensus, refraining from the excesses of rhetorical anti-communism, grasping the importance of open trade, multilateralism, and alliances, and accepting the bitter trade-offs that always inhere in the making of strategy. We would be wise today to emulate this strategic vision. Thank you.